So today, on our next episode of Behind the Curtain Wall, we're joined by an architect who has a passion for design, and it runs deep. His name is Jose Gelabert-Navia. He's a principal at the Perkins and Will design firm. Uh, and Jose has been immersed in architecture from birth. His both of his parents were architects as well, and I'm guessing it shaped a lot of his early memories. And his work has taken him around the world, and he's published many books about that. And so, as a fellow architect with John, both together have been professors at University of Miami, and Jose continues to be a professor, as he mentioned earlier. He's 7 years away from approaching 50 years teaching. So welcome, Jose.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And John is joining us today from the mountains. He's admiring God's architecture out there on a little vacation he's taking. How are you doing, John?
Good. I'm looking at about 85 degrees and very low humidity. Sun's out, and I have a forest that I'm looking down onto, which is pretty spectacular. Unlike in Florida, you're looking out of a condo towards the beach and the ocean. Here, it's all green. It's lavish green. The seasons haven't quite changed yet.
Beautiful. So today's episode is kind of exciting. We're talking about architecture as a living memory, and as architecture inspired by its cultural identity. And John and I were talking earlier today about the topic, and what's really interesting, and I think that's something that we can dive into head first, is really how the architectural skin, right, the exoskeleton, as John was pointing out, is at a crossroads between what would be the cultural memory that building skin has encompassed, right? And against the new efficiencies in terms of those technologies that we have with new building skins, right? And one of the examples that he was mentioning is having that Spanish style terracotta on a Coral Gables home, and now having maybe solar panels on top. So that juxtaposition of having something that's durable and resilient and also environmentally sensitive, but also has that the DNA of the surrounding culture, and where is that headed, and where are we going with that? And so I'd love to start off by asking you, Jose, you've been around many places, and I know you'll be talking about tropical architecture. What are your thoughts in terms of the crossroads that we're going into, where you have these beautiful buildings that resonate a culture, but now we're looking into what are what the global effort in terms of saving energy and being able to make buildings a little bit more efficient.
Well, like you had mentioned before, I've been teaching for a long time. This has been sort of a double life all my career. You mentioned the teaching is going on 43 years, but the practice, I started the office here of Perkins and Will, which is the second largest firm in the United States. And we started with 3 people, and now we have in our office here 54. And frankly, it's not a matter of adding in more and more people, but having a great team of people. But I was telling my world architecture class yesterday a story of when I lived in Venezuela. Fortunately, before the Chavez Maduro disaster that has happened as of late. And one of my roommates from college, who unfortunately died because of the lack of medical assistance in Maduro's Venezuela, um, which was pretty tragic. So when he and I were there together, I remember he took me to a building Philip Johnson had just finished. And Philip Johnson, maybe some of you might remember, he was at one point probably the most prominent architect in the United States. Everybody wanted a Philip Johnson. So this banker brought Philip Johnson to do this building in Caracas. And Alfredo and I went to see the building, and the building, which is the name it was still referred to as the Black Cube. And the building was a cube, all glass, black glass, and it had a courtyard inside which had a roof on it, glass roof. And I remember standing in front of the building. Again, it was Venezuela had just bought a Philip Johnson trophy. And Alfredo said, this building is really a building that says everything about our culture. And I said, it does? I mean, to me, this building doesn't look like it belongs here. And he said, no, it does. Look at it. Number one, it's black, just like our oil, which is the only reason that Johnson would have done a building here. Number two, it was designed by a foreign architect, which is again typical because no architects from Venezuela are good enough for some of our richer citizens. And finally, the material that is being used for it is completely imported. There is no support for the building in here. And as you can see, the panels are already beginning to pop out of the skin. And I said, and you think that that is appropriate? And he said, not that it's appropriate, but it is the story of what we are living through right now.
Wow.
And I've long since, thought about it. And the truth of the matter is that the client there, which was a prominent banker who now lives in Miami, this guy wanted a building that Johnson would have done in New York City, or maybe in Chicago, or maybe, again, in a place that had a climate similar to where John is right now, but not a climate like Caracas.
Sure.
And the material, again, like Alfredo had pointed out, there was no local representation. If the panels popped out, you would have had to put plywood on it, as they did, and then wait for months and months till the replacement came. So I use it actually as an example of an inappropriate technology for the location where it was. And then instead of looking at that, I show my students buildings that were done in Venezuela in the 1950s, before air conditioning was prevalent. Certainly in Venezuela it was not, but Caracas happens to have generally a fairly pleasant temperature because it's high, it's in the mountains. And these buildings were buildings that were built with concrete, and there's more sustainable materials than that, but it had to do with cross ventilation, great ceiling heights, openness. And, the buildings were still very much in use and popular almost 50 years after they were built. And it had to do with, again, people who knew what they were designing and for the environment in which they're in. And I always tell John that, he's much more knowledgeable than I am in terms of curtain walls. And again, he deals with the most sophisticated technology in the world. But my challenge, as we work in different parts of the world, is what is the technology that is appropriate. And frankly, I think it's a very exciting moment because people from all over the world are trying to say, how do we accomplish those things, but how do we accomplish them with something that is appropriate, that we have access to, that people know how to do, that we can give it maintenance, um, and ultimately, especially if you're building in the developing world, that it's affordable.
Sure.
Uh, but I'm sure John has very, you know, thoughts on it from where he sits.
So I just wanted to comment that the example of Venezuela and the expression of that architecture that you've described of the black boxes is kind of a a technology, I think, that is going to in the future is going to disappear to a certain extent. I think that for a very long time, there was a sort of evolution of the packaging, the wrapper of our buildings as this sort of very thin epidermis that its job was pretty much to keep to regulate temperature, to keep water out, to remain intact during inclement weather. The necessity, the requirements that it had to sort of deal with were almost as minimalist as the modernists, like the Philip Johnsons of the world, the Whites, and there was this sort of notion that this sort of modern sort of technology back in the day of the early modernists was going to sort of it should be the technology of the world. No, it became quite evident that regional differences in how we expected our buildings to look sort of to some degree modify the appearance of our buildings, and to a certain extent there was a sort of superficial use of the skin, and with sort of the evolution of the things that are coming, AI technology, the technology of glazing, for example, which you have bigger spans of glass. I was at a testing laboratory, construction research, a week and a half ago, and they were testing doors, sliding doors that were 6 feet by 14 feet tall. 6 feet by 14
Wow.
feet tall, impact glass, impact insulated glass, no? And so the technologies in the exterior envelope aspect have really gone much farther than I think 50, 60, 70 years ago. Just and what I think that there is now this an emphasis on in fact the regional environmental differences that when I was teaching with Jose at UM, by happenstance, I took over the course that Arthur Bowen was teaching, which was passive solar controls, and he was bringing back. I'll say 20, 25 years ago when I first met him at UM, the passive technologies that were being used in the Middle East, where there wasn't the type of consumption of air conditioning, and bringing those ideas as to climate. What climate are you in? Are you in a moderate climate where it's hot and cold, or are you a cold climate, or you're in a hot, humid, or hot, arid climate? Those are things that I was teaching 20, 25 years ago, but it really hadn't hit the main kind of highway of the code of the Florida Building Code of codes, international codes, um, and this sort of, especially in the last 10 years, there's been this sort of reorientation and redirection as to learning how to take into account the environment with these technologies that are current, and creating glazing and cladding technologies that are kind of exoskeletons, kind of like, I consider it's kind of similar to that hard skin, or that becomes the exoskeleton of the turtle, the shell that protects the soft inner part. It's not only keeping everything in, but it's also preventing that turtle from being devoured by crocodiles. No, it has a greater function, that of protecting against, severe conditions. And I think that now what I'm seeing much more of an effort to create these exoskeletons that are not only reflecting that sort of the cultural aspects, but taking into account this broader worldview of the value of the environment, and the energy that we're consuming, that is fair to everyone on the planet, that everybody should have a right to using their fair share of the energy. And so there's a either through policies, world policies, or by just the younger generations coming forward and understanding that for us, this time controlling the planet is just borrowed. We're kind of using this time that is borrowed from the younger generations. In fact, this planet that we're living on. So I think that there's a greater effort now, that the skin isn't just a signage of the cultural aspects, but a recognition that it not only has to deal with preventing water from coming in and air coming, or the air conditioning leaving, but more so that the energy that we're consuming, we do something better with it than just sort of letting it sort of spew out, because we have southeast facing walls that are just made up of glass, and the sun just bakes through, and all this energy goes into making air conditioning to keep us all comfortable. No, so I think that's where the trends are going. There's almost a global language now to the skin, which incorporates a true knowledge of how to sort of deal with this skin, that has to do a little more than just keeping water out and falling off, and that it's just a certain thickness, but that it also prevents the use of energy from not being correctly applied to that wrapper that we all like to look at and see and consider that's what makes us as a culture.
Right. That between what the two of you are describing, it reminds me a lot of that theory of, technology as a pendulum, where when a technology emerges, it's always on the evolutionary phase, but as the pendulum swings from evolutionary, it crosses over to revolutionary. So it improves on the last iteration, right? And so think of it in terms of, what computers used to be 40 years ago, where it was these massive clunky towers that you had to, in a way, modify your lifestyle to that. And today, they fit in our pocket. Those devices have gone through so many of these pendulum swings that it's gone to the point where it's built it's been modified to fit our lifestyle, right? And I feel like, and maybe you can add to this, but I feel like technology in terms of architecture, we've come to the point where we've arrived, and in terms of we've reached efficiencies and we've reached designs where everything has kind of leveled off in one direction. Now, how can we improve? How can we improve the skin to not just be practical in terms of what it can provide in terms of efficiency, but how can it be designed further so that way it fits into the mold of a society, or it fits into the mold of a particular culture.
Well, I mean, I think, I think there are two. I mean, we've talked about, I think, two issues. I think, like John and I would agree on the issue of being responsible for the climate, responsible for the implications of energy consumption and so on.
Right.
And what I was talking before is for, again, being responsible for the means of the culture that produced them. I mean, last night, I was watching in YouTube this it was really amusing, interesting, stimulating. Um, I guess it was a full-length documentary. These two guys from Queens decided to follow the footsteps of Marco Polo, and they started from Venice, and they went through Middle East, Central Asia, China, went back the way that Marco Polo returned, went to Sumatra, to India, and then eventually worked their way back to Venice. And at one point, they were in Sumatra. And then they went to this island off of Sumatra, very, very poor, where people were still living, the same way they did, frankly, 2,000 years ago. On the other, so that was, again, talk about a primitive culture. That was about as primitive as you will find in the earth today. On the other hand, the houses that they were living in, it was really, and again, I had shown my students that as well. Of course, they had no glass. They not only didn't they have it, they probably could never afford it. So they're dealing with houses which have an enclosure, which again has to do with dealing with the elements, keeping the rain out, keeping as comfortable as it can in a hot and humid climate on the inside. And then the things that they did as a matter of, again, architecture without architects, were things that now we are beginning to say, this is the way you should design. So by and large, all these houses were raised. Now we've realized that with seawater rise, it's a good idea to raise the level of the houses. Well, they had figured that out a long time ago because they had flooding. The skins, again, they had no glass, but they had different layers of, sometimes they had fabric, sometimes they had things done which leaves and the vegetation, almost like a basket weave that allowed light in, kept the rain out, allowed the breezes to come in. Materials that now we would call sustainable. Whatever they used grew back again. And they had high ceilings. The buildings were made out of wood, which is again what they had. They didn't have an option of using concrete, which is not exactly good for the environment. It's not sustainable. So these people were living in an extremely resilient fashion. more than the environment where, frankly, we live in here, which is, I certainly go from an air conditioned office to an air conditioned car to an air conditioned home. Uh, the only time except for going from one place to another, that I'm outside are either walking in the morning, which I walk at 5:45 a.m. So there's no sun then, and when I go swimming. So it's because we have means for the controlling. It has also made us, in many cases, be less curious about maybe more natural ways of dealing with the environment. And again, I know in here, if I design a house, I wouldn't put, basket weave vegetable uh, fabrics on the outside, um, but as I travel around the world, I find it, so stimulating and fascinating to see how other cultures have adapted out of necessity to deal with that, and also see, well, what lessons are there that here in the developed world we can learn from that and then apply it to the technology that we have.
Right. What do you think needs to take place in order for that to happen? For instance, here in
Well,
Miami.
well,
Well,
I think that,
go ahead. Look,
no,
I was going to say,
quickly,
to you,
yeah.
Jose, one of the things that, in regards to that question, no, the and it's interesting because you were talking about Venezuela, and I'm going to take you back to the Venezuela discussion a little bit. That our culture, and you describe it as as the civil, this Western culture of going from the car to the house to the office and air conditioning. For the time and I went to a program that was very, as a student, we would discuss the technology involved in the directionality of the sun during the different seasons, the how you sighted a building, and then when to use fins versus eyelids in order to shade the buildings, and have Florida rooms, and the proportionality of a building having the right proportions to take into account the movement of the wind, and all of those things. When I was at teaching, we would cover all of those subjects. All right, and those materials that would allow for light to enter and prevent ultraviolet to be a factor. How to introduce windows and doors in the right places so that you could take advantage of light through glass. Uh, I think that one of the things that I would tell you about our culture is that it's not truthful to these core principles of sustainability. Everybody speaks a good game about it, but nobody wants to leave their air conditioning. And I think that, in fairness, if we were going to take this to its logical conclusion, it would be that in fact you remove air conditioning from the equation, and you do deal with passive solar controls in a way where if this is where it's going to go, that everything is operable and everything is pretty much resilient enough that when a storm comes and goes, that you could pick up the pieces and put them back together again. Um, the nature of who we are as a society is that we need to create these invincible structures that will prevent all things from happening as long as we have our air conditioning. And until people let go of that and really recognize that in fact is the driver of many of the ills that we have, that I think that you could start talking about realistically defining our culture, at least the culture that I believe we are as Americans. I think that wherever you go, if you do not have air conditioning, you don't feel like you're comfortable. And until that we understand that we have to feel comfortable in the climate that we live in, I think we're going to start recognizing that our buildings are going to be more efficient because you have no choice. And I think that air conditioning is like the least common denominator. But how are you going to convince the Generation Z, X, Y, all of those that are coming behind that all they've ever known is air conditioning?
Right. And really, I mean, as a human race, how long has it been, compared to living without air conditioning? How long have we lived by large as a society with an air conditioned space? Whereas I feel like the majority of, from the beginning of time where we were settlers, right? There was no air conditioning, and we had to rely on how buildings were constructed in order for us to feel comfortable. So going back to that question I had posed earlier, what do you think has to take place in order for us to move in that direction?
Well, I think that there's the question you were asking, and actually, right now, almost everything we do in Perkins and Will is institutional buildings. But when I started out doing houses, and now I do an occasional one, one of the most difficult things is most people had, a, like in many things, a preconceived notion of what they wanted it to be. And in Miami, for example, there was a time that everybody wanted a so-called Mediterranean house. And the Mediterranean house, first of all, if you've been in the Mediterranean, a lot of these so-called Mediterranean houses were not very Mediterranean. They were, many of them, and I was responsible for a couple of them, they were McMansions. And to tell a client, hey, this kind of architecture, whether you have, very, relatively small openings, whether, all of these materials that you're using are perhaps not the best materials. And what I found myself in some of the ones that ultimately I was happier with, I had a client that, which is now I'm doing his third house, and I began showing him of the architecture that was being done in Southeast Asia, in places like Bali, in places like Singapore, which is producing some of the best architecture in the world today. And I was showing him that, these buildings are contemporary, but on the other hand, they have something to do with their culture. And look, the whole thing, the relationship between inside and outside, the openness. Yes, they do have air conditioning, but you don't need the air conditioning all the time. All of that. These guys got so excited about it. And again, neither one of them, one of them was is a doctor, and his wife, who had a very successful business, with mortgages. They went to Bali and they saw a lot of these things. They stayed in a few of these places. And frankly, they began buying, things, everything from materials um, to even furniture uh, that that they found there. And the house, eventually became, was built here. Uh, and it turned out, the original owner, he was the original owner. He eventually sold it, found it extremely livable. The guy who now bought it from him bought it with everything in it, all the furniture, everything, because again, he felt this is exactly what he wanted, what he imagined a house in Florida to be. And again, it took somebody that spent the time. Let me show you something different. Let me show you something that maybe is not your preconceived notion. And I remember he still jokes uh, when I see him, and now that I'm doing his third house, when he called me to do it, he said, Jose, I want you to design a Mediterranean house for me. And then there was a silence, and then he said, I'm joking. Uh, so the new house is not, again, inspired by Southeast Asia. It's a contemporary house, but it has a lot of the things that we've been talking about. So you need someone who might be, willing to spend a little time thinking outside the box, thinking of something different than the way that they always thought of things.
Right, right.
I'll add one thing to your talk, and I agree. I think teaching your clients the reality that we find ourselves in with the climate and energy and conservation. But kind of going to that notion of the pioneer technology and the examples, kind of the right examples and the wrong examples. The I went to look at a project to determine if the application of the stucco on this resort building in sort of more central Florida was if the cladding had been installed properly. And then when I went out to look at the building, it was a building reminiscent of a clapboard cracker style house of the early 1900s. Your typical shotgun type house, which was a very efficient technology for the environment in South Florida. And it was a kind of Disney-esque version because they were using stucco to install an appearance of clapboard siding or wood shipboard siding and board and batten and all of the casings and everything else, but in stucco. And there was a debate between the client and the contractor whether or not that could be done. And so when I went out to it, I said, well, first of all, the way the stucco is being utilized is a poor man's applique in comparison to how it should be done, which is out of wood siding. And those technologies of wood siding in the early pioneer days, and the board and batten was to allow for ventilation to happen between the boards, and at the same time allow for water to run off the boards as a rain diverter, but allow for air to vent out through the small apertures and things of that nature. And there was a whole concept behind all of that kind of cladding, But instead, the alternate reality is let's pretend to be something that we really aren't. It looks great, but it doesn't work. And currently we're doing a house. In fact, we're working with Daniel on a project that who's our host here, and we're doing an addition to a clapboard house that we're looking at the technologies and not only the siding but the layout of this sort of shotgun geometry that if you ever had to open windows and doors, you could get cross ventilation. And it's a technology rich with Florida history that most people are really attracted to, because if you go to Key West, you see these simple single-story, two-story buildings that are made of wood, and that they have the high ceilings and the double hung windows, and it's all about actually working with the environment, as opposed to the appearance of respecting the environment. No? And I think that kind of like that. It's kind of also that summons the idea of Frank Lloyd Wright, Inside Outside, with an aesthetic, versus Pablo Solari and Arco Sante, with actually the house becomes the outside and the inside, and it's very Indonesian in nature, and this sort of tropical mindset. That I know, Jose, you teach about this, so you're very well versed in it. But this notion of this tropical kind of house that in fact you can have air conditioning, but it works without air conditioning. No, I think that educating people how the skin works in order to siding a building correctly, and then taking into account that people have to get used to getting hot and getting sticky, getting sweaty, and they got to go outside because outside is good. Vitamin D, and there's all of these healthy reasons why outside is good. But I think that our culture is sometimes crammed into buildings because, you know what, they want to run away from the sun. And I think that as I've grown older and having been of the generation of the window pocket air conditioner, that everybody would sit around in the living room, but all the rest of the time you were outside in the heat. I know that I could go back to that. It's getting people that this culture today to recognize that you know, yeah, it's only been a short period, like you're saying, Daniel, of the air conditioning. We may have to go back to that time where, hey, you know, living actually in the environment is a good thing. You know, I remember also you and I listened to. I think it was Rossi when he came to give his presentation. He says, "Why are people so concerned about getting wet? You know, why are people? You know, you live in Miami. You should be used to humidity, no? And so many people run from it. So anyway, I think that where we go from here, I think that now the federal regulations. The Florida Building Code is requiring commissioning of buildings. We spend a lot of times educating, especially on higher residential buildings, energy conservation, and the commissioning of buildings that's now required by the Florida Building Code. So this is no longer volunteering and being a good citizen. It's the law. Some of these things are coming at us in a very hard way, in that it wasn't done before, it's going to be done now. No, so educating, I think, is the key, and I think that also you do it at the university at Perkins, and I spend a lot of time with my clients explaining to them what commissioning of buildings is going to mean to getting a permit. You know, if your envelope isn't commissioned now, you're not going to be able to close out your permit. And that speaks volumes to these huge projects that are being permitted under the 2023 code. The the building officials have now been told that they must enforce the requirements of the Energy Conservation Code that is in our Florida Building Code, which means that the skins have to be efficient, and architects are going to have to deal with demonstrating it.
Well, I think the other thing you've frankly, which again, a lot of it also has to do with architects, frankly, becoming knowledgeable too. I have a very good friend in Puerto Rico, who, I mean, is like a brother to me, like John. And Ricardo showed me his house. He just built himself a house in the middle of one of the most urban parts of San Juan. And Ricardo was actually worked with Robert Stern, who used to do these, still does some very traditional buildings. So he's a very, in many ways, still in his heart, he's traditional. So he shows me this house. He took me to the house, and the plan of the house, it's like a Roman house. And the house had this black tile, actually had these classical columns and all that. And was very a nice design, not what I would, do right now. But then when he told me, he said, I am off the grid. And I said, what do you mean? I know what off the grid means. You don't rely on the power company. You don't rely on the sewer company. You don't rely on the water. I said, what do you mean? And then he began giving me a different tour of the house. He took me to the garage, and the garage had all these batteries. And he said, you see the black tile on the roof? And I said, yes. And he said, all those tiles, which were Spanish looking tiles, were solar collectors. And then he went through the whole thing. And in Puerto Rico, power goes off quite often because of a horrible electrical grid. So he said, I am completely off the grid in terms of power. I am off the grid in terms of water. I reuse all my water in here. And he showed me and then he said, I am technically off as well from the sewer system. But that one, unless I have a real emergency, I don't turn on, and I still rely on the sewer system, because he said, I'm a little afraid of having a disaster in my house. But he spent some time educating. He's an architect, but how to do that. I mean, we all talk about it, including me. But to be honest, I don't, I'm not as well versed with the technology as someone like John is. But I was amazed, and then I said, so what is your electric bill? And he said, what electric bill? And I tell you, this thing was not off the grid in the middle of nowhere because he had no choice. This was off the grid in the middle of the city, and he did it in part because maybe the grid is not as reliable. But on the other hand, he had succeeded in having a house that in many ways could withstand what we go through with the hurricanes. I tell you, I was envious of that. Well, I live in an apartment building now, but I tell you, if you went to a client and you said, look, we can do all of these things, um, I could guarantee you, maybe not the whole thing, but there would be an appetite. But most people don't know how to do it. We talk about it, but we don't do it, or we don't deal with people who know how to do those things. You have to look a little. It's not the first thing that comes to mind here. Maybe in Canada, but not here.
Right, right. No, and one thing John had mentioned about, the Keys. I have recently done a trip to Key West, and he's absolutely right. You see that the housing, the houses there, they're built as if they belong there, right? It's almost like they're part of the environment in the way that they were designed to be optimal to the environmental conditions. And that really reminds me a lot of, in nature, how you see the foliage and, the trees. Palm trees grow naturally here, but, in Missouri, where John is right now in the mountains, you won't really see palm trees growing over there. You see more just a wooded forest and a different type of trees. And so, in a way, it almost feels like we need to look to how, natural the earth is. And John, you mentioned this before, and how buildings do become, like an organism in a way, right? And it's a living, breathing building. And I feel like that's a very true statement when it comes to understanding how can we align a building's environment to its efficiencies, and how do those two things meet together to not only represent the its natural environment, but also be efficient for a living space and represent the culture.
No, yeah, I agree. I think, look, I think, yeah, I think that Jose's example of his friend Ricardo in Puerto Rico is a wonderful example of one life that can maybe make a difference by example.
Right.
It's kind of like like the person in that speaks to this idea that love thy neighbor more than you love yourself, right? When that
Yeah.
idea was first brought up in the times of the Romans, it crucified a man, right?
Yeah.
Here you have a man in an urban center that says, I can create an off the grid type of technology with what I know that maybe can affect change. And the way that happens is also through education. I went to although I had the great fortune of teaching at UM. I also taught a little bit at Florida as a graduate student, and I went to undergrad and graduate school at Florida, and my professors were actually building back 30 some years ago, 35 years ago, their additions. They themselves are building their additions in Gainesville with composting toilets, and taking us to see that. And I remember various professors, Ira Winarski and that they and Gary Seabine actually physically doing these things, and being a young man in architecture, I thought my role would be kind of working, as a draftsman, kind of like in the examples, or the images of a studio where Frank Lloyd Wright or these famous icons of architecture, I would be, I would start there in drafting, and the way that I was taught architecture was, no, you have to put your hands in it. You physically have to be part of the process, and understand this. So because if you don't, how can you teach it? No.
Right.
I think that I haven't, other than those examples that I gave you at Florida, I haven't seen many even talk about what is a composting toilet, and how it works, and how it's good for nature and so forth. But that was something that stayed with me all of these years. So as I talk about the envelope of a skin and how that works, and we're talking about what the imagery and the history and what it represents. It represents our culture. Too many still are in this mindset that they want to get educated to be in air conditioning and not literally struggle with the environment, actually be part of the environment and kind of
Right.
building it within the environment that we're in. I've had some time to sort of explore the history of the saga of the Indians, here while I've been on my trip in Missouri, and you could tell that these people were wholesome people that were were part of the planet. They believed in what the earth meant, and stepping on the earth was even that should be that process of stepping on the earth. We should respect all of those that had passed and they are in the earth and what that means culturally. We still, as a civilized culture, don't really. We're starting to come to grips with something that's always been here, and so that when you're talking about sanitary, the times that I've had to deal with people's sanitary problems, I don't want to admit out loud, but I've had to become expert when pipes burst and how septic tanks work and seepage happens and all of these things because I've wanted to understand those type of things. So I think that there's coming of age that our younger generations are going to have to accept in order to use these houses that we're going to design that aren't just to show that they are organisms, as you were describing. They literally are living things. Um, and I think that that's where we're going to have to take society to sort of come to grips with. Not only that you can conserve on an electrical bill, but that you truly respect this world, this atmosphere, and just not talk about it, but be part of it, no? And
Right.
I think that we unfortunately have a disconnect where people don't believe that a job outside in 100-degree temperature is a worthy job, no? Or that fixing things outside, someone else can do it because it's hot and it's greasy and it's grimy and so forth. But I think that the true architect has to come to this place where they're kind of like a minister. They have to have this sort of theological understanding of what this means almost. And I say theological, sort of pseudo theological beliefs of what they're promoting, but they also have to know it and live it. You can't you
Right.
can't talk about, oh yeah, I believe in the environment, but you're driving a gas guzzler car. You better be riding a bicycle and feeling what that feels like as part of the processor, and consuming less energy and representing that you actually care for this environment and this world. And unfortunately, I don't think that I think that it's oftentimes easy to talk about, and people over the years have tried to volunteer in doing the right thing, but now you can't just volunteer. Now the law is saying you must do some of these things. You must actually take an interest, because what we're going to leave behind is for future generations. We're not just doing it for the one client or the one big business or what have you. We're doing it for the future generations that are going to use this planet. And I think we all have a role in I think that Jose does a wonderful job about talking about resiliency and demonstrating those things by example in Bali and these places. I absolutely, some of the stuff in Bali is wonderful. And Bali, and those people in Bali probably did those things because they couldn't afford gasoline and energy and electricity and the grid, right? But I think we're going to have to all come to this understanding that there's going to be a day where we may have to go back to the days when there was an air conditioner. And I think that's going to be an interesting, come to terms with how much do we really love this planet? Because that
Right.
really is what it's about, is do you truly respect the earth that you step on every day and everyone that came before to bring us to this moment? And I don't know if we're there yet, kind of from a philosophical standpoint as a culture. We're getting there. I think there's an improvement, no
Yeah.
question. Politicians know how to talk about it a great deal. That's for sure. But we architects, me and Jose, have been given the gatekeeper key to the use of energy and how can we make buildings more conscientious. We're kind of at the front line to this subject. So
No, absolutely, absolutely. You've done a great job of bringing it full circle in terms of buildings being a living memory. It's true that it you can't just think of it in terms of a short term, whether a short term may be 30 years, the long term is hundreds of years, right? Like how are we leaving this planet? And it's not just a nice saying to say we're leaving it better than we found it. It's true. We're trying to, as a society, be align ourselves better with how we're treating our planet. It's obvious because it as you're saying, it's becoming to the point where it's becoming mandated, right? So that's an interesting point. John, any closing thoughts you might have on this as we wrap up? I'll see if I can hunt them down in the meantime.
no, I would say that it is real. It's always a treat for me individually, to bring my people that I consider that I admire their work, and to bring Jose to talk to us a little bit about about his ideas of tropical architecture and the cultural aspects. I think the example of Venezuela is a wonderful sort of example as to what it is that his who are the people that create buildings that then eventually represent us, and when you started the conversation, we talked about those Spanish Mediterranean roofs, the barrel tile roofs with solar panels on top, and well, is that the most resilient solution to store to gain energy from the sun and so forth in a climate like ours where you have hurricanes, and will that in effect change the cultural aspects of what was left behind that are historical in nature? Because we like our history also. We don't want to lose our history. And so how do we enhance our history as a culture, but also understanding that we have this need to improve things, and how I can change or make a difference, is from a very pragmatic or practical way, which is, how does that skin interact and with the climate, the particular climate. In ours, it's either hot, humid, or very hot, humid. It really depends. And for the code to actually speak to climate, which is kind of new in this decade, it shows an enormous, and when I say the Florida building code, I'm talking about the Florida building code, how it's changed, where now we're talking about it as part of the code, because architects and engineers weren't voluntarily necessarily taking that into account. Now it has to be taken into account. So there are inroads, either by by being a good neighbor or because the law is mandating it, no? So there have been changes, especially in these last 10 years.
Right, right. And I think, you were onto something when you were saying that we have to educate our clients. And really, the onus is essentially going to fall on architects to really push that envelope, right? To really, as Jose was saying, you just, be able to take that leap of saying, well, have you tried it this way? Or have you considered this type of a design, or how they're doing it over here? And I think that those are really the baby steps that need
Yep.
to be taken in order to move things forward in that direction.
Yes, I agree with you.
Anything you'd like to close with, Jose?
Well, again, I really appreciate, first of all, your patience, Daniel, in dealing with me, and I appreciate the friendship with John. Um, I think what makes this whole thing so exciting is the process, and I've always believed that architecture, unlike other arts, is a collaborative project, and we need a great client, but we need great collaborators. And it's wonderful and stimulating again to be able to work. And my experience working with John has been great. He raises the level of anything that we do. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone who took the time to listen to us.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for joining us. I already said some wonderful things about you earlier, and so you could rehear us. But I just wanted to thank you. It's always great talking to you. You know that, and say hi to Mel. I say, I fortunately have Sue, and you have Mel, and they provide us with so much fortitude and support in our endeavors. So we have a great, we have at a very personal level, we have great supporters. So thank you, Jose.
Well, it's
All right,
it's been a pleasure. Thank you all, and thank you all for attending.
Yes, thank you, Jose, and everyone. You can always tune in next month for our next episode. This one should be available by Thursday to re-listen to. Thank you so much, everyone, and looking forward to the next one.